Very good morning to you this Wednesday morning, the 3rd of February. It's good to have you with us this morning. We're looking this week at the concept of one anothering, the heart of defining what fellowship is. It's being there for one another, and there are some between 40 or 50, well, depending on which version of the scriptures you read, that talk about one anothering, doing things for one another. Now, it's very easy when we're thinking of these instructions, if you like, encouragements that we find in Scripture, the importance of needing to help one another, support one another, encourage one another. It's very easy to slip into the mistake of thinking of these as rules, religious regulations. But nothing could be further from the truth. As the Apostle Paul makes very clear in Galatians chapter 5 and verse 1, it's for freedom that Christ has set us free. We are free from the rules, religious rulings. So these are not new laws that are brought into place. They are actually an outworking of our salvation. And again, that's a concept that Paul uses in his letter to the Philippians, where he says, work out your salvation. The outworking of what God has worked in our hearts and salvation, this will be the evidence that can be seen. And when he writes to the Galatians, talking about this freedom that Christ has given us, he says, don't be subjected again to rules and laws. That's in Galatians chapter 5 and verse 1 and 2. Don't allow yourself again to be subjected to religious rulings, but work out what God has done in your heart. Let that be seen in the way you live and the way that you relate to other people. And so, again, when writing to the Galatians, Paul says in chapter 5 and verse 13, you have been called to live in freedom, my brothers and sisters. But don't use your freedom to satisfy your sinful nature. I can remember those discussions that we had as young adults, and the attempt to find loopholes in what the Scripture says. The kind of argument that said, I'm free to do as I like, so I can sin, and I can sin boldly, and it doesn't matter. No, the Apostle Paul says, don't allow your freedom to satisfy, to be an excuse for satisfying your sinful nature. But he carries on and he says this, instead, use your freedom to serve one another. Use your freedom to serve one another. There's another one anothering. Serving one another. Just as Jesus said when the apostles were debating who was most important, and he says that whoever wants to be first must be your slave. And just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve. And the word that he uses, they did not come to be served, is the word diakoneo, with which many of you would be familiar. And from that we get our word deacon. In Acts chapter 6, the first deacons were appointed to serve at tables. It could be as mundane as that. And yet he writes to the Galatian churches and says, you are free. Don't use your freedom as an excuse for sinning. But let the outworking of what God has done in your hearts be seen in the way that you serve one another. And what's interesting here is that the word used to serve is not the diakoneo, serving at tables. The word used here is the word for slavery. Make yourself a slave to others. And that encouragement to do that doesn't depend on only those who have a certain status in the church or a certain status even in society. To one another, we are to be as slaves serving one another. And then in Galatians chapter 6 and verse 1, we're encouraged to carry one another's burdens. And in this way, he says, you will fulfill the law of Christ. And so, no matter who we are, no matter what status we may have, as part of the family of God, we are called to serve one another. Not only to serve, but to serve as slaves of one another. And that requires a great deal of humility. And maybe we have to ask God to give us the humility to be able to put others first. And so this morning, as you take time out, won't you ask the Lord to show you who you are aware of, who needs help, who needs someone to come and serve them in one way or another. It could be in a practical sense, providing a meal, or helping with transport, or I can't think, I've just gone blank at the moment. But it could be in any practical sense to actually get alongside and help one another. Or it could be just being there as a friend, not necessarily having answers, but just being there to serve one another. And ask the Lord to give you the grace, the humility to be able to serve others today. It's a working out of our salvation that God has worked in us. Pray that you'll discover that today, if never before. And God bless you as you serve others.